This is the third part of the lecture on the policy implications of growth theory. And here I go particularly into the details of research and development based growth models and the policy implications that derive from them. So the focus of this part is on how to foster innovation and invention. The standard and crucial way to foster research and development and thereby innovation and invention is to have a well-functioning patent system. We've seen this in the models on research and development-based economic growth, and we also see it in reality. A patent system works as follows. So the inventor or innovator of a certain idea that leads to a marketable good is provided with the right to be the only and exclusive supplier of this particular good on the market. So monopoly rents are generated for this innovator and inventor over a pre-specified period of time that is usually about 20 years in the US and in Europe. The associated monopoly rents of selling the goods can be very high. So for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, compare the cost of producing a pill to the often sky-high consumer price of such a pill. And these huge monopoly rents should incentivize to come up with ideas in the first place or to invest the huge amounts of resources that are actually required nowadays to come up with a successful drug or other goods, basically. And usually it's the case that the positive societal effects of patent-induced innovation vastly overcompensate for the monopoly distortions that arise through this monopoly system, so this monopoly rents. So the bottom line here is that it is very important to have such a well-functioning patent system to incentivize research and development in order to foster innovation. However, there are also problems with the patent system, and it has been criticized for various reasons. Particularly, patents can also actually block innovation. So there is this problem of fragmented patents, or it's also described often as the tragedy of the anti-commons, where patents in a certain area are held by different firms, and that stifles innovation of one particular firm. Or one particular firm tries to acquire the patents in a certain area in the first place in order to be able to innovate later on without others being able to block this innovation. Sometimes also patents are granted or extended on already known innovations that are either not patented or have been patented in the past, and slight changes actually in the formula or so of a drug lead to an extension of this patent. Also, that does not really foster innovation. Then there are patent trolls, so firms that file for patents without ever having the intention to produce anything useful, but to just use the patent rights to sue others for patent infringement. And of course, this can also block innovation and invention quite a bit. And then the litigation costs are often really high and often higher than research and development investments of firms, as Besten and Meurer have shown. In addition, the evidence that strengthening the patent system boosts useful innovation is actually surprisingly weak. And relatedly, there is an example from health where patents are actually completely useless. That is for curing rare diseases that by definition do not have a large market. Or also, for example, to invent new antibiotics or antibiotics of last resort. So by definition, they should only be used in emergency cases and therefore do not have a large market. And if you don't have a large market for the good that you want to invent, then the monopoly rents are basically not really useful. So for the treatments of rare diseases or for developing antibiotics of last resort, the patent system actually fails to give the incentives that are necessary to come up with these innovations and inventions. The patent system has also been criticized for not leading to a very high rate of return on societal investment. So this here refers to a case study that was mentioned in the newspaper The Economist in 2015. And what they did was a calculation for the US healthcare system for the year 2005, where they spent around 210 billion US dollars on purchasing prescription drugs. The numbers have surely increased since then due to inflation, population aging, new drugs that are expensive and came on the market, and so on and so forth. But it's not really important to have up-to-date figures here for grasping the argument. So the US health system spent around $210 billion on prescription drugs. And the estimates actually suggested that in a competitive, patent-free market, the same drugs would have cost definitely no more than 50 billion US dollars. And that was kind of a calculation that was very much in favor of the high cost for these drugs. So the difference then is 160 billion US dollars just in the year 2005. And in this year, the drug companies in the US estimated that they had spent 25 billion US dollars on research and development. Now, that does not seem to be a huge rate of return on investment. So you spend $160 billion to get $25 billion in research and development. And one may wonder whether these $160 billion would not have been better invested by spending it directly on governmental funded R&D, or kind of in other ways, basically, to incentivize research and development. So the question overall emerges whether there are certain alternatives or perhaps better complementaries to the patent system that generate more impact for the societal investment. And the good thing is that the answer is yes, there are many such ideas and mechanisms that can be used as complements to an intelligently designed patent system, and I will go through a few of them in the following slides. So of course the first is public expenditures on research and development, public R&D as it is done on universities and research institutes, publicly funded research institutes. Prizes, innovation prizes, such as the Ansari X prize that really fostered innovation quite a lot in certain areas. Then the grant system that can be actually reformed to incentivize R&D even better. Then for some researchers, earning money does not seem to be the prime motivation actually, and something like recognition, publicity, and awards seem to be more important to them. And finally, advanced market commitments have been suggested, particularly also promoted by the Nobel Prize winner Michael Kramer. And they are an alternative mechanism to get research and development in areas where a market basically does not exist, such that monopoly rents would really create the incentives to do R&Ds. For example, for curing rare diseases or curing diseases for people that mainly live in low-income countries and don't have that much spending power. And that could also be applied for antibiotics of last resort. I will go through these 5 strategies over the next slides. Now, the first is public research and development. So for basic research, for example, where we all know that the laws of nature cannot be patented, actually most of research and development happens at publicly funded universities and public research institutes. However, what can be shown in the literature, and I've also contributed to this with my colleague Katharina Werner in 2016 and 2017, is that the socially optimal investment in public research and development is much, much higher than actual spending by governments. And the reason is mainly that governments actually are more focused on the short run because they want to win re-elections that usually happen in a few years or even months, while the benefits of research and development, particularly of basic research, accrue very far in the future, sometimes decades away. And that means that there is typically underspending on basic research or on public R&D. There is also no reason actually why public R&D should not be extended to more applied areas. For example, the MP3 format was actually invented at a public research institute in Germany, but then the rights were sold to firms or to the private sector actually, which then made huge amounts of money out of this innovation. And it was sold for really a very low price as compared to the huge revenues that it generated later on. Now, what would be the policy recommendations in this area? Of course, the first one is immediately clear. Raising funding for public research and development would be a very important thing to do. And also making sure that regulations do not stifle applied research and development by publicly financed entities. So, for example, if this research institute could have been able to sell MP3 formats more directly, or develop it more directly, that would surely have been a very interesting avenue. And related to that would be to foster spin-off startup creation of public research and development institutions, which could also go a long way in fostering the transition from basic research to applied R&D and then to marketable products. The next item on the list are innovation prizes. How does an innovation prize work? Well, there a certain foundation, or it could also be public money that is set up, is kind of promised to a team or a person, innovator, inventors, that achieve a certain goal first, or that come up with a certain innovation. One example for this is the Ansari X Prize that was set up in 1996, and it promised 10 million US dollars for the first private company that is able to send a person into space using a reusable capsule and repeating this within 2 weeks. And actually this money was won in 2004 by the Tier 1 project of Spaceship One that was designed and financed by Bert Rutan and Paul Allen. And actually these $10 million then sparked an investment of $100 million in new technologies in this area in pursuit of this prize. So arguably the rate of return on this investment was much, much higher than the one that was previously described in case of the patent system in the drug market for the United States. In addition, such prizes would also be useful in areas where no market exists. So for drugs that are used to cure rare diseases, for antibiotics of last resort, or in this case of this example with the Ansari X Prize, for achievements that cannot be directly marketed actually, such as sending a person into space, which then nobody would have paid for, of course. So overall, these innovation prizes really preserve the competition effect among different competitors to come up with a certain solution to a certain problem, but they do not come with the granted market power later on. What would be the policy recommendations in this area? Well, I think it would be very useful to set up more funds for prize money, particularly in domains where patents are ineffective, such as for curing rare diseases or for antibiotics of last resort, and to run regular challenges or tournaments with such breakthrough prizes in order to foster innovation. Another area where it seems to be the case that huge resources are actually put into getting comparatively low effects in terms of innovation and invention is the grant system. So we all know only too well that these grant systems are often highly ineffective because many different research teams spend months and years in writing research proposals that are then evaluated, again spending huge amounts of time by other researchers, and in the end there is typically not enough funding for all the projects that are actually deemed worthwhile to be funded by the referees. So huge amounts of resources go into grant applications and refereeing, and very often similar projects are not granted, so there is only one project in a certain area granted, despite the very important competition effect that you would have in granting money for different teams that are then working on the solution to one particular problem. So what could be policy recommendations to make the grant system more effective? So I mean, the first one, of course, is obvious, to increase the funding for grants so that they are at least able to fund all the projects that are deemed worthwhile by the reviewers of these projects. Then proposals should be short and focus on the main innovation such that it is easier to write them in terms of the time resources that go into this. And nevertheless, the main innovation needs to be described in detail, but a literature overview and huge plans for what will be done in year 2 and year 3 and so on and so forth, which anyway cannot be really planned in case of research and development, that should be scrapped. In addition, this would save quite a lot of time for reviewers of such projects. And third, one could tinker with the award mechanism. So, for example, maybe it's not the best idea to make kind of money available and say different teams have to write a proposal in the first place, but maybe it's a better idea to spend money on 5 teams actually, and then defining intermediate goals. And those teams that reach these intermediate goals in, say, 1 year or 2 years or whatever, they receive further funding to carry on. So that would spur the competition effect without actually kind of spending huge amounts of resources in terms of writing grant proposals and reviewing them. Now we come to recognition, publicity, and awards. And this is based on the observation that some inventors actually even refused patenting. A famous example is Tim Berners-Lee, who is widely credited as having invented the internet, basically. He refused patenting and said it's important that this innovation is actually out to benefit humanity. And also researchers at public research institutes and at universities know that, so they cannot really sell their innovations and inventions. For them, it's more important to have recognition by their peers. So R&D is often driven by other motives than profits. And the problem is, of course, that in reality, the standing of scientists and innovators is often even undermined. We've seen this in the pandemic, we've seen this with respect to climate change and many other aspects. And one kind of indication that this is the case is also if you look into newspapers, you find science and technology parts at the end after, I don't know, celebrities and stuff like that. Although we've seen in all the lectures here that research and development actually shapes our modern lives, and they are hugely important to determine well-being, much more important than politics and a lot of other stuff. Nevertheless, kind of the standing of scientists is not really huge of an issue. And that, of course, could be changed. Promoting the standing of scientists and innovators, of course, is important in this area. Awards for promising breakthroughs by individuals and firms could also help in this regard. And for example, if people want to set up a startup after they've invented something, then it's sometimes much more important to them not to have a monopoly right on their innovation and invention, but to have help in setting up their startup in the first place and in advertising the good that they have introduced. Finally, we come to advanced market commitments. That's actually a concept that is very much promoted by Michael Kramer, as I said, as a solution to the problem that the patent system often does not come up with the right incentives to develop a vaccine or a drug, particularly for diseases that are rare or where the spending power of those who suffer from the disease is not that high. And such an advanced market commitment would be something where the government or donors commit in advance to top up or to even pay in full in the first place a newly invented good or the drugs that are invented or a certain amount of them, such that the company who invents the drugs can make profits out of them and can calculate with these profits when making the decision to invest. And this has been successful, for example, in case of pneumococcal vaccine, as described by Kramer and co-authors in 2020. And also in case of various COVID-19 vaccines, the programs that were run by the governments back then could be described as some forms of advanced market commitments. And here the policy recommendations would be to setting up more funds for such advanced market commitments. They are particularly useful in health, of course, but one could also experiment outside of health markets with such commitments. Of course, there are also many other policies, and I've just talked about some examples that I think are important. In general, of course, a very conventional one are tax credits and subsidies for private research and development. They have been also built into the research and development based economic growth models, and usually it's shown that these tax credits or subsidies should be much higher than the ones we actually observe in reality. The availability of venture capital is very important for startup creation that is done with the ideas that people come up with. So some countries really struggle to come up with venture capital for successful innovators, and that's definitely an area where policymakers could make a huge difference in providing the necessary funds. And of course, as we've also discussed in part 2, education and training for scientists and innovators is a very important point and aspect. To summarize the insights that we've gained in this part, we've seen that to promote well-being, innovation and invention are essential, and an intelligently designed patent system here is of utmost importance to promote innovation and invention, but one could also use complementing alternatives or complementing schemes to get innovation and invention also in cases where the patent system fails. Most important policy recommendations that we've seen are to increase governmentally funded basic research investments to up to the optimal societal amount, to foster the translation of basic research to applied research, thereby also to foster spin-offs and startup funding for people who invent at universities, to establish generously funded breakthrough prizes in various areas and also to provide the funds for advanced market commitments, to reform the grant system in a way that it is not such a waste of resources as it is now, and perhaps also that it fosters more competition among different teams. And finally, of course, to improve the standing of scientists and innovators in society, or at least to prevent them from being attacked for various reasons in the media and in the news. So thank you for your attention here on this part or this series on policy recommendations that are derived from growth theory. And here are some references that I used in this, particularly in part 3.